ABC NewsRadio.
I think it'll be later this afternoon. There's going to be a whole series of events that are starting already. I think this morning in Jerusalem with, as you said, Jared Kushner and Donald Trump's daughter are here. And then there's going to be a bunch of festivities over by the new embassy, which actually used to be one of the several consulates in Jerusalem. So it's going to be a whole day affair. In fact, there were events last night at the Foreign Ministry with Netanyahu and Israel's officials.
How have people in Jerusalem been reacting to the opening? Is there anything happening on the streets? What's the mood?
Today it's totally quiet. There's nothing happening on the streets. But yesterday was a day they called Jerusalem Day, which celebrates the 1967 victory and the conquest of Jerusalem in 1967 when the city was unified and the old city where the Jewish holy site of the Kotel was returned to Israel's hands. So I think yesterday was a huge event, and then today it's very quiet. I think sometimes people mistake the idea that lots of Israelis are celebrating the idea that the capital's in Jerusalem, because for Israelis, since 1948, the capital's always been in Jerusalem. So I think that it's a little bit misunderstood sometimes in foreign countries that it's great that Americans are finally recognizing what's always been the case on the ground. But for most Israelis, it's like, yeah, okay, but of course there's an embassy here. Of course it should be here. It's our capital city.
You say it's pretty quiet on the streets today, but there has been a bit of an escalation in tensions in recent days, hasn't there?
There's been about 6 or 7 weeks of protests in Gaza in the lead-up to what the Palestinians call Nakba Day, which is, they say, the catastrophe of the foundation of Israel in 1948. So there's a whole series of things coming together at the exact same time, with the embassy move and Nakba Day and the protests in Gaza, that definitely lead to a lot of tensions. But it's unclear the degree to which the actual protests in Gaza are larger today, because I think in the first few weeks, they were like 30,000 people. So it's a question as to whether there's some sort of spark or something that sets off sort of riots or any sort of thing like that. I think there's a lot of security, and certainly Israel's security forces are on high alert in terms of any kind of event that might happen. When I took the train into work today, there were guys looking for suspicious packages and police on the rail line. So definitely the city officials are certainly concerned that there could be terrorism or some sort of protest or something like that.
How many other countries are following America's lead in opening embassies in Jerusalem?
I think that we've heard something like half a dozen have indicated that they might, or that they definitely like to. I think it's a question of then seeing whether that actually happens, because some of them have indicated, yeah, we want to move the embassy, but then, as you know, it's not always a simple process, because in some case, for instance, the president or someone else has to decide. So it's not always a question of exactly that it all of a sudden happens. I mean, America has been wanting to move the embassy to Jerusalem for decades. In the 1990s, the Congress in the U.S. Said that the president must move the embassy, and there was always an exemption. So none of these things are really cut and dry, but I think that there's about 6 countries that have indicated they will. And as we also know, Russia has recognized West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So certainly things are trending in the direction in which there will be more diplomatic representation in Jerusalem.
I understand Guatemala and Paraguay are among the countries looking to follow the US lead. Why are some Latin American countries largely sympathetic to Israel?
I think for Latin American countries, there's always, first of all, some of them had embassies here in the 60s and 70s. And I think also they're not as vulnerable, for instance, to the issue of whatever before has kept some European states, because of their relations with Arab states, or the Palestinian lobby has kept them from saying, well, we would like to be more balanced. I think for some Latin American states, there's not a feeling that they necessarily have to be part of this idea of a peace process, or that they're playing some sort of role between Israel and the Palestinians. For them, they feel that they can have a direct relationship with Israel, and I suppose when there's a Palestinian state or what have you, then they would also have an embassy probably in East Jerusalem or wherever it is for a Palestinian state. So I would assume that that would be their kind of interpretation, just because whatever happens in the Middle East just doesn't affect some of these countries in Latin America as much, so there's not as much pressure on the other side not to do it.
How do you think this move might affect any prospective two-state solution in the future?
I'm not sure it affects the two-state solution, because I think if we look back from the 1990s when there was the Oslo Accords, there's been a two-state paradigm that's kind of sat over the the quote-unquote peace process. And there's been no, as far as I can tell, no real steps towards creating a two-step solution in the last 10 or so years or 15 years. So it's not clear why deciding that all of a sudden the American embassy will be in Jerusalem would change anything. I think from the American perspective, their idea is that as long as they kind of give the Palestinians this fait accompli, actually we're going to recognize Jerusalem as the capital, it takes that card out of the Palestinian deck, because Jerusalem was always one of those major issues, and it could always be held over Israel and say, we're not going to recognize Jerusalem until Israel negotiates some more. And I think now we're going to look at another step in terms of how these negotiations take place. And it seems that the Americans will put forward some sort of a peace proposal apparently in the next few months. And then it will be up to Israel once again to say whether or not they're interested in doing that. But as far as I can tell, there doesn't seem to be any interest on the ground in Israel or the Palestinian territories or in Gaza towards some sort of a real two-state solution at the moment.
Do you think the US can still be seen as an impartial peace broker, or do you see them as favouring one side?
I think it's clear that America is basically in the Israel camp. America is Israel's closest ally. It provides Israel billions of dollars in military types of support, and it always supports Israel basically in the Security Council. So I think, of course, America has in the past brokered all sorts of peace negotiations, and perhaps during those negotiations, America can then, work with both sides or pretend it's unbiased. But at the end of the day, America is basically totally and fully in the Israeli camp. And that's always what it has been for the last decades, and I basically always will be, apparently, in the next decades in the future. So I think the idea that America is some sort of impartial player is a little bit of a myth.
abc.net.au/newsradio. Get your news now.